Okay, so we were learning yesterday about the exemption that had originally existed for the fourth blessing of Birkas Hamazon. And the Imrei Yaakov had quoted the poskim, which we saw in the Mishnah Berurah also, that nowadays this halacha doesn't apply because it's implicit that when an Orthodox Jew goes to work for someone, goes to work for another Orthodox Jew, that time is allowed to get to even if there's no official lunch break, which by law I think there has to be, but time is still permitted to allow this guy to do the full benching. Okay. Now, what we were in the middle of this Imrei Yaakov yesterday, zimun, as far as the obligation, whether or not you can take time to have a zimun, imhu ochel im anashim acherim. Let's say you're working at IDC or one of these other very big Orthodox companies. Okay, so it's another big company where there's a lot of Orthodox Jews. I don't know. I know an IDC was owned in Newark, New Jersey, is owned by Howard Jonas, and so a lot of Orthodox Jews used to work there. I don't know if that's still true, but anyway, let's say you're in the lunch room. And there's a whole bunch of guys. Are you allowed to take time out of your workday to wait for someone, to have a zimun? So you finished your lunch first, and you can either go back to work or you can wait for the other workers so that you can have a zimun. So you shouldn't. Now you could say, would you guys mind answering, even though you're in the middle of your sandwich? Let's say they say, no, we're going to wait until we're done. So the question is, do you have an obligation to wait on them? He says the answer is no. Because then you can assume the balabayas does not want you to wait. He wants you to get back to work as soon as possible. I guess maybe we're dealing with in a contemporary situation where your lunch hour is over because they staggered the lunch hours maybe. And so your lunch hour is already over. And it's either a question of getting back to work or waiting for these guys to answer for a zimun. Uchlalo shel davar hasachir etzel chavero le'ezer malacha shetiyeh hine kol sha'osov muchuros hein liyoma. And the bottom line is that when you rent yourself out as a worker to your friend, your halachic status is that your time is sold to your employer during that time. And any time that you take away for your own personal use while you're working for your employer is an act of theft. It's an act of theft. There's no other way to describe it. Your mamish stealing. So it's going to turn out that when people get up to Shamayim and they say, I was a completely Orthodox Jew, I was completely halachically observant, and then they're going to show you, wait a minute, you were a Goslin. What do you mean? I never stole a thing in my life. Well, what about all those times that you were paid by the hour and you spent 20 minutes on the phone that one day because you needed to deal with the phone company, right? For your own personal phone. And if the employer does not forgive that time, then you can't say that it's forgiven. In other words, there are times when the employer gives you allowances to take time away from work. But if he doesn't, he doesn't. Let me just finish the line. And furthermore, this is just a quote from the Mesilas Yesharim. He says, even if you're doing a mitzvah during the time you're taking off from work, in other words, you're helping to organize a fundraiser for a really important charity, and you're doing it during your business day, that's considered a sin. That's not going to be considered an act of tzedakah. That's not going to be considered a big mitzvah if you're doing it at the expense of your job, at the expense of your employer. So obviously, if you make your own hours, that's one thing. But if you're working for somebody else and you promise that you'd get a certain job done, and you're instead taking the time for whatever mitzvah you feel is important. That's beautiful that you want to you do the mitzvah. It's really beautiful, but that's not correct. It's still a form of gezel. Yeah, Paul.
Does it depend on the nature of your work? In other words, if you're service oriented, you have to deal with customers, or you're working on a simple line and things to happen, I can understand. But if you need to get a certain amount of work done in the day, you take that extra time at lunch and then finish off at the end of the day, put those extra 20 minutes in later, does it matter?
Well, I think it depends on the nature of the relationship with the employer. Many times an employer will have the attitude, I don't care how many hours you work, but you have to finish your assignments in a timely fashion. If you can get it done at home, or you can get it done in 5 hours instead of 8 hours, that doesn't, the truth of the matter is that what people are saying today is that it shouldn't matter how many hours you work. It should matter whether you're able to get the job done, which is, it's an interesting perspective, but it all depends on the nature of the work, right?
Where I don't know how it works, but if one person does certain pieces and the next person waiting for those pieces to be complete,
exactly, right.
You have to be there.
And then you got to be there, right? But let's say one lady is working completely independently, and she's able to finish her work more quickly than others, then maybe the employer wouldn't mind if she spends half the day on the phone, talking to her family or whatever. But it all.
So it's rear ends on seats. Is that how it should be measured? You just having the person there, you should get paid for them because they may be there and not.
And they're not productive. Yeah. Yeah. So it's got nothing to do with that. But you're like he says, the language that the Mesilas Yesharim says is your time belongs to your employer. Okay. Another thing that we said is that a worker is not allowed to weaken their physical constitution by either starving or depriving themselves of sleep. And that, we've probably all been guilty of that at one time or another, where we're doing something fun and exciting, or on a Sunday night, let's say, and we know we've got work at, 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock the next morning, but you stay out late at the wedding, or you just have to finish this series, and it's only 3 more episodes, and it turns out that those 3 episodes take another 4 hours, and you don't get to bed until 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning, right? So then what happens? You got to wake up, got to come to Choshen Mishpat Shir at 6:10 a.m. and you're wiped, totally wiped, and that really affects your performance for the rest of the week. So that's a problem. But anyway, Ein Lakamen Seif Chaf Dalid, Divrei HaMaskal Urishai. He says we're going to learn later on in Sif Chaf Dalid. Right now we're in Sif Chaf, but when we get to Sif Chaf Dalid, we're going to see the Yesh Omrim De'im Hu Poel Bekerem Uchedome Sheyesh Lo Heter Le'Chol Misham V'Yachol Yitkayem Bazeh Rashai Lahariv Atzmo Mikodem. That if a person works in a food business, a food industry, let's say he's a farmer, and he works in a vineyard, then perhaps he would be permitted to starve before going out to work in the vineyard, because you are permitted to eat while you're harvesting, and you can eat some of the grapes. So therefore, that'll sustain you. And we'll see later on what the ramifications of that are, that if you do starve yourself, are you going to be eating more grapes than you normally would? And is that considered to be taking too much from the employer? So we'll get to that later on. And this is also a cautionary halacha for teachers as well. a person who's a teacher, a rebbe at a school. We had said you have to be very careful about not taking away time from your employer to take care of your personal stuff. Kosav harama de'ein lamalamed lios ner b'layla yoter midai shelo yihiyeh atzel bayom lilmod. That the Rama writes that a teacher should not stay up too late at night, because then it'll become sluggish during the day. Nor should he fast, nor withhold himself from, diminish his eating patterns, or to eat or drink too much, because all of these will cause him to be unable to perform his work properly. So even if you're not, let's say, an hourly worker, right? You get a salary for just doing your regular per year, like a salaried teacher or a salaried professional. You also have an obligation to be fully alert and well nourished, not to be stuffed and not to be undernourished, and also to have had a good night's sleep. Because if you're not, you won't be able to perform your task properly. And if a person does change, and as a result, his job performance is compromised, then that's cause for termination with cause. And he doesn't have he can't claim that I have protected rights. Apparently, he has a whole separate sefer on the laws of teachers, teachers' rights and teachers' obligations, and he has extensive discussions there. Maybe I'll take a look at that later. So you have to be careful about all of these things. But if you're an Orthodox Jew and you're working for an employer and it's a Tainus Tzibor and it's a public fast day, meaning it's like a Tainus Esther or Asara B'Teves, then you're obligated to fast, because that's part of the allowance for religious observance that an employer has to make. Okay, Neor B'Layla, you shouldn't stay up too late or wake up too early, because it's going to compromise your job performance. But that's not a reason to prevent you from waking up early to say slichos. If especially you're a Sephardi and you wake up the whole month of Elul, they wake up super early to say slichos. They have longer slichos the whole month of Elul. If that's the minhag of your community, that's sanctioned. Chaveiro b'chanus aser, and if a person is appointed to be the shopkeeper, the guy who's watching the store, he's not allowed to, like the language was, asur lasok b'malacha b'chanus mipnei she'ein einav ala chanus. He's not allowed to engage in other work if he's appointed as the cashier or as the overseer of the store, because by engaging in other work or in other stuff that you're doing, even if there are no customers currently in the store, this may cause you to neglect your guardianship of the store, and it could cause people to come in and engage in shoplifting, etc. It's really, sometimes it boggles my mind. You come into a store and there's no one there because the guy's in the back. Well, who's watching the store? If it's one thing if but depends on what's being sold. But if there are small goods that can easily just be pocketed and walked off with, how can you leave your post? Okay. So the af she'eno ose kol hazman be'esa kachanus, and as the Imrei Yaakov says, even if you're not every second engaged in the needs of the store, but you're sitting and waiting for buyers to come in and cash out, but you shouldn't be doing other work which will distract you, because that will cause you to not be able to pay attention to what's going on in the store. So, it could be, to be on your phone when there's no one in the store and you're sitting there right in front so you can see everything that comes in and out. It could be that's fine. But that's not enough of a distraction, but maybe to go into the back and to engage in video games or whatever it is, that could probably be problematic. Or,
This one is responsible to have something with you, go to the washroom or something like that. That's obviously something that's permitted. So,
well, what people generally do, if you have to go to the washroom, you lock the front door.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
In today's working environment, besides maybe going on the internet, that where I can see that is maybe from a guessel, but the texting. I mean, it's become Dina Mahudina. That texting is just part of everybody's life and everything. So that there's a certain amount of time that people spend every day just texting with and communicating with people. So even as simple as a few texts, is that form of gizmo?
Yeah, it can be. It depends on who the employer is. Let's say, like Paul was discussing, there's a production line. You have a production line, and every time one of the persons on the production line stops to respond to a WhatsApp, they're slowing down the production line. The employer has a right to call in his staff and say, when you're on that production line, your phone must be off, period. Yeah.
2 hours for 15 minutes.
Yeah, you can do it then. I mean, it's not so. It depends on the nature of the business. If productivity is slowed down because one of the workers on the factory floor is constantly responding to texts, then sorry, I'm sure that in certain businesses it's not tolerated, right? I would imagine in any factory that produces goods, they're not going to tolerate it for a second. Yeah, right. Absolutely. It's a form of theft if the teacher gets a text and is in the middle of teaching a pasuk and says, "Excuse me, children, I need to respond to this text." That's theft. You're stealing from the children. You're stealing from the institution. Yeah, absolutely. And you're taking away time from Torah, right? So especially in that kind of situation. But I don't think that you can say, well, everyone's doing it. I don't think that's a legitimate excuse in certain industries. In other situations, then maybe. But I've had situations with cashiers and store clerks who are responding to texts when I'm trying to get information from them, and that's simply, to me, that's unacceptable. The customer service is flown out the window, right? Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's go on to the next halacha. Chaf Aleph. Poel ha'oved labalabayas. Okay. Oh my gosh, a lot of stuff here. Bein b'schirus lizman, bein b'kablanas. It could be that they're working for them by the hour or by the day. It could be they're working by the job. Afilu kibel kfar kol scharo yachol lachzer bo be'emtza. Even if the employee has already received full payment, they can actually back out of the work. They can quit at any time in the middle. Oh my gosh, there's a ton of stuff here. The pulaso im eno gorim shum hefsel labalabayas, provided that this does not cause financial loss to the employer. And so if you're not causing financial loss to the employer, you have a right as an employee. And one of the employee's rights is he can quit the job midstream. Shenamar ki li v'nei Yisrael avadim avadaihem velo avadim la'avadim. So because, and this is based on the principle that you're not an indentured servant. And by virtue of the fact that you're not an indentured servant, and the Torah doesn't want you to be a servant, you do have the independence, you have the autonomy to say, I quit. Sheyavdu shelo birtzonam machmas shekvar niskaru. No one can coerce you to work for them because you were hired, right? So even if you have a work contract, halacha permits you to terminate yourself at will. V'lachein yesh misha omer she'ein lapol o melamed o mishares lahasker atzmo lios bebayis beveis balabayis echad bekeva yoser migimel shanim. That it is for this reason that there is an opinion, which we'll see. I don't believe we paskin this way. There is an opinion that says that a worker or a teacher or a domestic housekeeper or butler should not enter into a service contract or should not work for an employer for more than 3 years. Ki ad gimel shanim nikras sachir, kamo shekasav b'Yeshaya, because up to 3 years you're called a laborer, as it says in Isaiah. B'shalosh shanim kishnei sachir v'nikla v'goymer. The pasuk in Yeshaya says that for 3 years are like the years of a worker. Uve'eved ivri nemar ki mishneh sachar sachir avadecha shei shanim. That an eved ivri is called repeating the years of a laborer for having worked 6 years. So that implies that someone who is an Eved who works for 6 years, because an Eved Ivri works for 6 years and goes free on the 7th, is working twice the amount of a regular laborer. What you see from both of those psukim, that if working more than 3 years, yatsa michlal sachir v'nichnas bichlal Eved, then you start becoming a servant. Torah amra ki livin Israel avadim avadaihem v'lo avadim la'avadim. And the Torah, as we quoted above, says that the Jewish people are my servants, and they're not meant to be servants of other servants. Umikol makom im ein lo ma yochal rashai afilu limkor atzmo la'eved bisman shahayovel nohe. But at the end of the day, even if you don't have food to eat, then the Torah does allow you to make yourself into an indentured servant and sell yourself into slavery, but only so long as the Jubilee year is extant in Eretz Yisrael, which it is not nowadays, not since the temple was destroyed. Shene'emar b'chiyamu chachicha v'nimkar lach, that when your brother is impoverished and he gets sold to you. So you see that that's a possibility. But then he writes in parentheses, Aval ha'isha eina yechola limkor atzma mishehivia simoni na'arus. But a woman does not have a right to sell herself into servitude once she reaches puberty. And therefore, according to this opinion, that more than 3 years, a service contract that goes more than 3 years is considered servitude, this would apply to a woman as well. And so it would basically apply to men and women. So this is a very, very bizarre halacha, admittedly, but basically saying that once you work for an employer for more than 3 years, you've become their eved. So you should avoid that. But obviously, there are going to be qualifications to that. I have a 5-year contract with the shul. So I don't know. What do you call me, an eved? I don't know. Sometimes I feel like an indentured servant, but anyway.
But I mean, does it matter whether it sounds like they're not differentiating between 3 year or longer contract or just working year to year but extending it past 2 years?
Yeah, so that's that. So obviously, there's going to be certain exceptions to this rule. I'm pretty sure we don't paskin this way, because otherwise you would never be allowed to enter into a work contract for more than 3 years, right? So, yeah, well, we're talking about Jews, yeah, because the whole commandment of not being a slave only applies to Jews. A non-Jew is allowed to be a slave. There's no Torah prohibition from enslaving a non-Jew. They're obligations that I have to a slave of mine that the Torah places upon me, that if you do own a slave, you have to treat them with tremendous respect and dignity and so forth. Okay. Okay, so there's a lot. Obviously, there's going to be a lot to see here. Why don't we get started? Poel ha'oved. If you have a worker who's employed either as a sachir or a kablan, which is by the job, he says, Kaimalan de balabayas shesachar poel b'li kinyan rak b'dibor. He says, we have a general rule that when a balabayas hires a worker and it's just a verbal hire, so the first rule is, we know that whoever wants to can terminate the agreement at any time. The employer can terminate, and the employee can terminate. And the reason why this is not considered to be cruelty is because the balabayas can say to the employee, it's an open market. It's a free market. Go find work somewhere else. And the worker, also, it's a free market, can say to the balabayas, find another worker. But there certainly is a sense of bad feelings whenever someone quits or is fired. And those bad feelings are real. Because if the employer does the firing, it's going to take time for the worker to find new work, and it's going to take effort, and it's going to take time. And the same thing is true. If a guy quits on me and I'm the employer, it's going to take me time. It's going to slow down my productivity. And furthermore, we also remember from the very first simon that we learned in Choshen Mishpat that there's an idea called mechusar amana, that if you give your word that you're going to work or you're going to keep someone under your employ, and then you just fire them or they quit in the middle of a job, that person is called mechusar amana. They're acting in bad faith because they gave you their word that that you would employ them for a certain amount of time, or vice versa. And furthermore, the only time that there are legitimate grievances that the halacha would be concerned about is when the termination was for no cause, right? But if there is a very strong argument to be made why I quit or why I got fired, he says, let's say I hired a worker, and I hired the worker to transport goods to a certain place, and the guy's in transit, and I discover that the goods have already been sold, and therefore there's no reason for it. I've sold the goods to another more local person, and so I don't need him to travel. So he's only gone, he started driving the truck down the block. And then all of a sudden I discover that there's a local person who wants to purchase the goods and I don't need his services anymore. So I just have to pay him for a short amount of his time, but I shouldn't be obligated to pay him for the full distance. And the Shach writes that if it's such a work market, such that a worker who gets terminated can easily find work somewhere else without any hassle, and the reason why the guy has to fire him is because he doesn't have to work for him anymore, so he doesn't even have a right to complain. V'hadam rinin da harishus biyadu lachzor ve'en lam tvias mamon ze al zeh. Hainu davke kishlo gorem hachozer hezek lahasheni kidul kaman. But as we'll see, the only time that an employer has a right to terminate an employee, even without cause, even though the guy was fully ready and able to do the job, is only, and where there's no, the guy has no legal recourse, is only when the termination did not cause the employee a financial loss. But if it causes the employee a financial loss and vice versa, by my quitting in the middle of the job, if it causes my employer financial loss, so then there is legal recourse in halacha, right? Because in other words, what we're talking about now is something that is probably mostly theoretical in most situations. All right. Well, anyway, we're over time. We'll do it as well.